Oyez, oyez, oyez. Anyone having business before the King's Justice of the Superior Court shall be heard. Long live the King, the Honorable Justice Hennessy presiding. You may be seated.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Morning, sir. Thank you. I realize that at each time that an expert has been on and there has been consent to the qualifications, I have not followed up by saying, and the expert is so qualified. So going back, let's just assume that I have said that.
Yes, I think that is a fair assumption, and all council consent to that, yes?
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh. I don't have a computer. Excuse me. I need
Yes.
2 minutes.
This court recess for 5 minutes. We'll now resume.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. O'Riordan.
Good morning.
I have left up with the court and with the witness and with my friends a couple of additional documents that I may reference. And we will mark them as exhibits if and when we get to them. But I'd like to ask a couple of questions to start, if I might.
Yes.
Now, before I do that, I want to just telegraph to the court and to my friends behind me that I expect that I don't have that much more to go, and that people will be out of here, if not by the lunch break, then shortly after. That's sort of looking at the list of things I have to talk about.
Okay, thank you. And I have a 15-minute call at 1 o'clock.
Okay, so we can comfortably fit that in.
Very good.
So the first thing, Mr. O'Riordan, you would agree with me that between 1850 and 2019, there was at least some economic rents that the Crown captured from the treaty territories?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that the Crown captures economic rents both directly and indirectly?
Yes, I would.
The Crown captures as part of the economic rents the actual NCRRs that it in fact captures and records as NCRRs, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Now, the Crown also captures some of the rents indirectly by the imposition of taxes like corporate taxes and sales taxes, right?
Correct.
The total, would you agree that the total economic rents actually captured by the Crown is something greater than the NCRRs actually received?
Could you repeat it again, please?
The total economic rents actually captured by the Crown historically, yeah, sorry, we're having a technical
Oh, okay.
problem.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to try the question again.
Yeah.
The total economic rents actually captured by the Crown historically from 1850 to 2019 is something greater than the NCRRs actually captured. Would you agree with that?
I'm just thinking that through that could well be. What I would add about the NCRRs is that economic rents would be a portion of net Crown resource revenues, because to some extent they do get captured. So the net Crown resource rents resource revenues, I'm sorry, would not all be rents. A lot of it wouldn't be rents as we would define rents, right?
As you would define rents.
Well, as I think all of us would define rents. Recall, rents are the portion of gross proceeds above competitive returns. So some of those competitive returns are subject to tax, and those are the net Crown resource revenues. That said, as I testified yesterday, there are economic rents, and to some extent they may be captured and probably are captured in the net Crown resource revenue calculation. For example, those that we mentioned that would accrue to labor, to superior managerial skill and so on. Those are subject to taxation, as are the returns on capital. And so that portion of economic rents would be captured. probably much of the economic rents that would accrue to land would not be captured. And I think that's the point of Dr. Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, that those never do get captured. But I do agree with your point
Thank
that
you.
some portion of net crown resource revenues would include some rent.
No, that wasn't my point.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, perhaps
Okay.
we can go to the chart and take a look at this, and because I think I want to conceptualize things and make sure we're all talking about the same page. So I'm holding up a bar chart. It's got 3 bars on it. It's on the computer screen. And it's something that I just made up last night, to try and make sure we're talking the same language. Now, the first thing I want you to note is that it says on the top of it in handwriting, not to scale. You see
Yes,
that?
yes, I see
And
that.
that's important because
Agreed.
I'm just trying to conceptualize what economic rents are all about. Now, in the red bar is the rents captured as net crown resource revenues. You see that?
Okay, yes, I do.
And that's accurate. The crown captures NCRRs. That's the red bar. You agree with that?
No, that's where we start to have our conceptual difficulties or disagreements. So, but I love the chart, and pictures help. So let's talk about the chart. The red bar that you have are net crown resource revenues, right? We agree.
Yes.
What I'm saying is, to your point, some of those net crown resource revenues probably are economic rents, but most of them are not. Most of those are taxes that have been imposed on the profits of the company or the revenues of the company, and they are captured as net crown resource revenues. Some of them are rents, agreed. They are stumpage fees. Okay, just a second. Okay, now I've seen it differently. I'm with you now.
Okay.
I was seeing these as the taxes that were collected by the government, as opposed to
No.
the stumpage fees and the mining taxes and so on. So yes, fine.
All right.
Apologies, took me a minute.
That's
First thing
okay.
in the morning, new slide.
Okay. No, that's fair. So let's sort of just dial it back a bit.
Yep.
You would agree with me that the pink, or what I see as red with my eyeballs, is rents captured by the crown as NCRRs.
Yes,
Now, whatever they are, we don't have a value there because
not to scale.
we don't, it's not to
Yeah.
scale because we're trying to understand conceptually the issues.
Yep.
But on top of that, you said the crown actually captures parts of the rents. And I've got a yellow bar in the middle
Mhm.
that is meant to show the rents that were actually captured historically by the crown. And I do say by others, because I don't want to confuse or get into a debate about who captures what and at what proportion. So, but you would agree with me that on top of the NCRRs, which is the red, there are rents that are captured by the crown and others.
Yes.
And if you'll see the parentheses, somewhere between what was actually in real life, in real terms, actually captured by the crown and others,
Yeah.
in between the top line of the rents from NCRRs and the top line of the rent actually captured, which would be 100% of the rents, some portion of that was captured by the crown that are not included in net crown resource revenues. Would you agree with that?
Okay. I think this again maybe is where we need to have a discussion and come to, a common view of things. Your middle bar that
Can we
says
go by color?
by color,
yellow or gold?
yellow or jaune or gold.
Yeah.
I would say that those are all the rents, because you've said they're captured by the crown and others, and those others would include the mining companies.
Yes,
So,
I agree. They're all the rents.
So there aren't really any rents left on the table. If you think again back to first principles, the overall amount of revenue, right? The gross revenues realized from the land include a component of rent and a component of of revenue to the companies, you know, the returns. Okay, the company, to the extent that rent wasn't captured, it was taken by the companies. It's gone. It's all been captured.
Yes,
None of it was left over.
Right.
So there aren't any additional rents to capture if the resources were optimally managed over time. They're all taken.
well,
I just, your green chart, if you kind of moved it over to the yellow, I think you could use that conceptually to say if the resources were optimally managed over time, and I take that, you tell me if I'm wrong, but I take that your meaning there that the Crown could have increased their rates of taxation to capture the rents. Is that what that is getting at? If
we're going to get to the green line, and
Okay.
what the green line is trying to represent is a different world than what actually happened. That if people
Yeah.
had sat down and said, you know what, let's optimally manage the resources in a way that can extract as much as we can, as quick as we can, it would be something marginally greater than what actually happened.
So in your conceptual world, they could have actually increased the rates of extraction and extracted more ore and timber and so on?
It's just a hypothetical,
Right.
because the important point I wanted you to agree with when I
Right.
got there
Yeah,
was that Stiglitz and Hutchins do not operate in the world about what would happen if things were optimally managed. Stiglitz and Hutchins are firmly in the yellow bar, not the green bar. You understand that?
no, not really. I'm having difficulty with your chart. And I do agree, this chart is probably useful if we can work through it and talk through it
Okay.
and then come to sort of a common understanding of
Okay,
where the rents are and who's got them and how much more
Okay.
is left, okay?
so let's go back. The red bar we're good with. The NCRRs, there's not a problem, correct?
Right,
We are
Well-
actually of the same mind in respect of the gold bar, because you said you think it's the total rents, I think is the phrase you used, and I
Yeah.
agree with you.
yeah,
The yellow bar is intended to show the total rents actually captured by the Crown and others. In reality, there are no other rents to capture. They went somewhere. You agree with that?
yes,
Okay. The point about the parentheses is that I'm trying to get you to confirm your understanding that in addition to the NCRRs that the Crown captures a portion of the total rents over and above NCRRs. I'm not saying what portion, but it is a portion. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that.
And the parentheses is to identify that somewhere in that range is what is actually captured by the Crown over and above NCRRs. You would agree with that?
When you say parentheses, can you tell me what part of the chart you're
I
referring to?
guess it's the left-hand side bracket.
The bracket, okay,
I guess technically perhaps it's a bracket. A
I think so.
parentheses is a square one.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
we can't even, we're
No,
working on agreeing on the terminology,
Okay.
both of us.
So the bracket, you would agree with me then that somewhere in that range identified on the yellow bar that exceeds the red dotted line and ends at the top of the total rents actually captured by the Crown and others represents rents that either the Crown or someone else captures, but within that range, the Crown actually captures some of the rents over and above NCRRs, correct?
Right.
Thank
You,
you.
you could actually move the left column, the red or pink column, to the right and have it as the bottom portion of the yellow column, could you not? If I
Yes, and
understand
that's
your,
why that's why I've got the red.
you're just
dotted
doing it
line.
so, yeah, that red dotted line indicates that that's the portion of the rents that are captured as NCRRs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why the red dotted line is dotted to try and show
Yeah.
that you could have moved it over, but I wanted to try and explain it
Right.
stage by stage. if
Yeah,
you will.
yeah,
But
yeah.
you're with me so far.
yes.
So far, the red or the pink is accurate. The gold is accurate. Yes?
But not to scale, which is
No,
important
no,
to
not
keep,
to
to keep
scale. We-
repeating because we don't know the parameters or the proportions, but yes, conceptually, yes.
Okay. And then we have the green.
That's where we have a potential
Well,
disagreement.
perhaps.
Yeah,
So again, let's start with your helpful guidance, which was the green what if rents, if the resources were optimally managed over time. The bottom portion of the green that is underneath the red dotted line, again, we could put the NCRRs there as well, correct?
sure. We could have one column
Right.
with 3 colors.
Yes. And the next portion between the red dotted line and the yellow dotted line, again, represents the rents captured by somebody over and above NCRRs in the real world.
Yes,
You agree with that?
yes,
And what I'm suggesting to you is that over top of the yellow dotted line is the what if world if things had been done differently and rents were optimally managed over time. Would you agree with that?
no, and that's where we need to have a discussion back and forth about where we may have a difference of opinion, I think. And some of the difference in opinion may be terminology. So we could, we could sort that out like
Yeah.
we did with parentheses and brackets. We can sort those things out. But conceptually, I don't believe this. I believe that there wouldn't be any additional green above the gold line. And I can explain why I believe that.
Okay.
But I'll leave it to you to.
No.
to-
I want, here's what my thought was, and it's good
Right.
that we're trying to
Yeah.
sort this out.
We will sort it out.
All right. My thought is that the bar of green over and above the yellow represents a what if things were done differently.
Yes.
And can we at least agree that how things may have been done differently in the past is irrelevant for this court case? Or what, in calculating,
Say again.
sorry,
Yeah.
maybe I can preface it this way. What Stiglitz and Hutchins tried to do was to figure out where the top of the yellow bar was. You understand that that's what they tried to do.
That is what they did. Yeah,
Okay.
I do agree with that. I mean, they've calculated the yellow bar.
Well, it was an estimate. I mean, they
Yes,
said,
well, I appreciate that. That is much better said, actually. That's what I should have said. That's their estimation of what the rents are.
right, and they estimated it and they said that they thought it was conservative and they testified
Yeah.
about conservative elements and suggested it might have even be higher in real life.
They did.
But they came up with a number that was an estimate.
Yes.
And what they did not do is they did not ask themselves the question, what if the resources had been managed differently than in fact they actually were? They didn't ask themselves that question.
That's correct. I agree with you.
And so whatever may have happened in the what if world, which I represent as green, the
Yes.
green bar,
Yes.
is not relevant for Stiglitz and Hutchins. Would you agree with that?
Well, the hypothetical is relevant to all of us, though, because we have to ask ourselves how realistic the measurement of Stiglitz and Hutchings actually was. It was their best shot at measuring the overall extent of rents, given the way the market is. And I take your point, we can have a discussion and should about what if the resources were managed differently and optimally as we define. And we can define those in different terms, but it's relevant because for Justice Hennessy to use this methodology, what I've been saying is I don't believe it's reliable and it's subject to too many assumptions where there can be many disagreements one direction or the other. And at the end of the day, we don't have a reliable counterfactual scenario. And we always need the most reliable counterfactual scenario. That's why I was quoting from the other study. We all should agree on that. Whatever compensation is, it should be based on what should have happened and could have happened. So the green bar is relevant for discussion. But again, I don't believe that the economic rents is a methodology that the path we should choose to go down. I do think net crown resource revenues is better. And the chart makes it look small, but it's not that small.
When you say that, what are you referring to?
The scale of the chart.
Right? I didn't, that's why I said not to scale,
Agreed.
right? I'm
Yeah.
just trying to
Yeah.
conceptualize it. So
Yeah.
just to summarize, you would say
Mhm.
that what may have happened in the past different than what happened in reality is an important fact.
Yes.
You would at least agree, and that's the green bar, correct?
Yes, that's the green bar, and we need to discuss the proportions of the green bar.
Okay, well, let's, before we discuss the proportions.
Yeah.
You've already agreed with me that Stiglitz and Hutchings didn't use the green bar or didn't think it was important in their analysis for calculating past compensation, right?
Just before you
Yeah.
answer, your question was, you've already agreed that Stiglitz and Hutchings didn't use the green bar. Would it be correct to say Stiglitz and Hutchings didn't estimate the green bar or propose that one should estimate the green bar?
Well,
Is that the same thing?
Included within the green bar are the NCRRs and the
Sorry.
rents actually captured in reality.
The top of the green bar.
No, the top of the red line and the top of the yellow dotted line are both things that Stiglitz and Hutchings did do.
Yes, my question, and maybe I'm wrong assuming this. My question is, when you say Stiglitz and Hutchings didn't use the green bar, I'm presuming, I did presume you meant the portion above the yellow dotted line.
Yes, exactly. And I apologize to the witness for not being clear about that.
Okay, so they didn't.
No need for
And-
apologies.
And in fact, I'm now looking at this as if it's a single column
You could.
with red
Yes.
at the bottom, yellow in the middle, and green at the top. So but they didn't, your question was, they
Yeah.
didn't use the green bar above the yellow dotted line. And so then my point was, use means they didn't propose or suggest that it should be measured, nor did they estimate what it was.
Correct. That
Is
is a
that-
better question than I put it. You would agree with that?
I think we're all on the same page.
Okay.
At this
You would
point,
agree
at
with
this
that,
point.
Mr. Reardon?
Yeah, I mean, I think Justice Hennessy's point, I took the same point. I see that as a single bar chart with.
Right, but do you agree with, but I'm putting the question that I thought Mr.
Yeah.
Schachter was putting to you. So
Yeah.
now we're looking for the answer.
Yeah, so my answer would be that the green portion of the column, the portion above the gold line, okay, which is in excess of the rents actually captured.
Yeah.
I would argue that the green portion would actually more than likely reduce the gold portion of the column. There would be no green above the gold portion. the green would actually push the gold portion down.
That's what
If I can
would happen
explain.
in their
That
methodology,
what would happen,
but they didn't,
but they
But-
didn't go there.
they didn't try to measure,
They did not.
and they didn't propose it should be measured.
They did not. And the reason they didn't is because they
okay.
simply said all of those rents should be taken by the Crown. 100% of those rents should be taken in tax. So they captured all of the rents. Now, the green column though is worth discussion. It's quite relevant because let's start with just optimally managed. What does that mean? It could mean several things that weren't done in the factual world, but could have been done in the counterfactual world. And one I made reference to yesterday, and that was the idea of rents including social benefits and social costs. They were never included. And you could make an argument to optimally manage those resources over time. You should take them into consideration. If you're causing pollution that's damaging the environment, that's impinging on the Aboriginal ability, indigenous ability, the inhabitants of the land to use it recreationally, that sort of pollution damage, that degradation of the environment should be included, and it should be properly. One way to do it would be to tax it. And I would say that's not the only way. You could pass regulations to do it and so on. But to the extent that you optimally manage those resources, you would at the same time be reducing the economic rent. You would be reducing the economic activity in order to take some of that rent and allocate it directly to the rehabilitation of the environment to combat pollution. And it wouldn't be available either for the Crown or for the Anishinaabe for their purposes, for distribution purposes, to take the tax revenues and distribute them to them. They should instead be devoted to the land, if you like, to the environment. So that's not the only difference. That's one difference in terms of optimally managing the resources over time. And that would probably slow resource extraction, not necessarily depending on the technology, but it probably would. The other element that's not here, and I thought this is the element that I thought you were getting at, that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings didn't do. They didn't really calculate optimal taxes. As Dr. Mintz and I have talked about optimal taxation, that's where the concept of economic rents comes in relation to fixed resources like land and so on. In theory, you can tax those resources without distorting capital investment decisions. And you can set tax rates that are much higher than were set by the province in terms of stumpage fees or mining taxes or whatever. You could optimally manage, and the context here when we say optimally manage is to maximize the returns to the Crown, which wasn't done. I mean, forget whether they were ever intended to be redistributed or there was a treaty. In any country, in any jurisdiction, the tax authority could increase their rent taxes and capture more of the rent. And that would be viewed as optimal to the government because they're getting additional tax revenue up to the point where they, I would say, maximize it subject to certain constraints like the capital being drained away. So the green column, they didn't really get into the details of
When you
that.
say they didn't.
I'm sorry, I keep using that they, don't I?
We'll try and
Doctor,
capture you.
you'll maybe by the end of the day.
They is Stiglitz.
They
and
is
Hutchins.
Stiglitz and Hutchings. They didn't calculate those rates because they didn't have to, because they simply waved a magic wand and said, all of the rents should have been taken. Let's assume they were taken. And that's the measure. It's all of the gold bar.
So I thought I heard you just explain to us that the optimal managed over time is something greater than what actually happened.
No, I would say it would be less for a variety of reasons that are on the record from yesterday. If they,
Okay.
I'm not sure that greater is understood greater in amount of dollars.
Yes,
greater in the amount of dollars, it would be
Is that what
less.
you understood?
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
so you would say that if there was optimal management over time, then what happened in the real world would result in less economic rents being captured by the Crown and others. That's what your opinion is.
It would be less economic rent captured by the others and more economic rent captured by the Crown. The gold bar again has all of the rents. And the only thing that would change would be the proportion of the rents that accrue to one party or the other. So optimal taxation, I would agree, would increase the Crown's revenues. The Crown could have realized more revenues from the land than it actually did. Certainly in theory, and in practice, that's where you have to slow down and take into consideration in the real world what would have actually happened in the counterfactual. But really what you're doing is taking more of the rents away from the mining company or the logging company or whatever, and the Crown is taxing them and retaining them, possibly distributing them if there's a treaty obligation and so on, then the Anishinaabe would have received more rent. But I would argue that that is all a reduction of the gold portion of the single bar. So if there's a single bar at the bottom with net Crown resource revenues, the red, it could change a little bit, but I don't want to muddy the waters any more than they already are. Let's just say it stays the same. The gold portion then, the Crown would receive more and the resource companies would receive less.
Okay.
But the problem is the overall height of the column, I think would probably be reduced. It wouldn't be as tall because some of that capital would be drained away. And again, Dr. Mintz and I have been making the same point. You in the real world, you simply can't capture and retain all of the economic rents.
Okay.
For real world considerations of how taxes operate. If I can,
Could I jump in here on one thing?
please.
I thought the question that was being asked, given examples that had been given a couple of questions ago, was that the green bar might represent greater extractions. Do I have that right? He could have taken more trees. He could have taken
Yes.
more minerals. That had
Yeah.
the operators, had Glencore and
Yeah,
Falconbridge and
yeah,
Domtar, Ontario Paper Company, had they taken more out? In other words, and the words being used are optimally managed.
managed.
So managed to increase the harvest or the exploitation.
Right.
That's what that could represent, that green bar, that still exists out there. But for whatever reason, Crowns decided how many trees could be taken out or how many pounds or research was such that only so many pounds of minerals could be taken out. But there are more trees. And
Yeah,
there always
and-
were more trees than were taken. And
Yeah.
there always were more pounds of minerals, but we stopped having open pit mining,
Yeah,
for instance.
yeah.
So if I have that right, Mr. Schachter, that's your
Yes.
question to the witness. Is that not possible that had the resources been managed in a different way, not done and not measured, that there might have been more rents?
And okay, and that's a fair question, and I'm happy to answer that question. In my opinion, no, I don't believe that there would be more resources taken if they were optimally managed.
I think well, for me, the question is, it's not would they have been if they were taken.
Oh, if they were taken,
Yes.
there could have been higher rents. If there were additional production and so on, there could have been higher rents.
That's it.
But I can't conceive a scenario, a counterfactual scenario where there would have been more resources taken. I can picture some where there were less resources taken, especially if they're optimally managed.
Well,
I
there was
mean,
a strike for 10 months in the mine. If there's a strike for 10 months in the mines.
yeah. If there's a strike for 10 months in the mines, that year's production would be less, no question, but the mine will make best efforts to make up for that lost production, additional shifts and so on. I mean, the companies operate to maximize their profits. And most of them are price takers. So they're exporting most of their product to the world market. And they take prices and they try to maximize either their revenues or their profits, depending on their scale and scope. I mean, that's just what economics tells us. So I think they harvested as many trees as they could and sold as much ore as they could, given current market conditions. They will try to, they will try to project where market prices are going, like any natural resource or any agricultural product producer. They will try to sell more when prices are high and less when prices are low and so on, manage their stocks. But I don't believe that there would have been materially any increased production here, more likely less. And another example for softwood lumber, for example.
Is
I mean,
it, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but is it fair to say you operate on the presumption that they take as much as they can?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that,
That's good enough.
Okay.
I think we've actually got a good explanation from you about your views, and for me, this kind of helped clarify some conceptual differences. If there's no objection, I wouldn't mind having this marked as the next exhibit, the bar chart. Of course, it's only as good as the explanations the witness gave for it, but I would like it marked as an exhibit if there's no objections.
it's a document created by Mr. Schachter to
That's just the witness
put
that
questions to the witness.
he identified was accurate, but with comment.
So what specifically am I
Just
needing?
wait, we're gonna hear that.
That's fine.
Yes.
Mr. Rankin, any comments? So we're calling it.
Is it
then-
35?
And the name is
Um,
a bar graph created by Mr. Schachter.
Can we call it demonstrative bar graph? Level of rent, of economic rents, would that be fair, Mr. Reardon?
Well, it's your chart. I hate to,
What would you call it? I
I
want,
don't think it's appropriate to ask the witness to name the chart, the chart that you prepared.
I think it's fair to ask him.
He might be helpful. A bar
What would you
graph.
like to call it? What do you think is fair?
not to scale.
Okay. No, we want to make sure that everyone knows it's not to scale. I get you there.
Yeah,
But what can we call it? Graphic demonstration of economic rents, or what would you like? Is that good? I should have put it-
conceptual chart of economic rents, not to scale. The-
Yeah, that's perfect.
I would, I'm sorry.
Conceptual chart of economic rents not to scale created by Mr. Schachter. How's that?
I would suggest we call it Mr. Schachter's conceptual chart to make it absolutely clear that it was your conceptual chart.
I like that better too. Because I honestly don't,
Okay.
I
That's
wanted
fine.
to add, subject to my commentary, because I disagree with the chart, obviously.
Well, no, you haven't disagreed with much of the chart.
Oh, I have.
Okay,
Okay, Mr. Schachter's conceptual bar graph of rents,
of economic rents.
of economic rents.
I'm fine with that. Thank you. Can I put it brackets not to scale?
Yes, you can put in
Okay.
brackets not to scale.
Thank you.
Okay, once that is done, perhaps, I shall move along. Now, yesterday, Mr. Reardon, you talked about social benefits and social costs need to be taken into account.
Yes.
And that is part of economic rent analysis as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I said they could be taken into account. I didn't say they need to be taken account. Right, but they could, and maybe they should. I go that far. Right?
Right.
Right.
And to the
okay.
extent that they were taken into account in the past, those are reflected in the actual numbers.
Well, I don't believe they were taken into account in the past in
Thank you.
any of the studies that I've seen.
Yes, thank you.
Can I
And,
just catch up for one moment?
sorry. I'll just wait for the court.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Would you agree with me, sir, that social benefits of development include such positive externalities such as creating investment and job opportunities?
I would call those the economic benefits rather than the social benefits, just in terms of correct terminology.
Okay. But a factor in calculating economic rents, a positive factor, correct?
Yes, yes. I mean, those are essential elements in order to create the economic rents, right? We all agree on that. You can't just have the land, you need the labor and capital resources, and that's what creates the employment and the output and so on. So yes.
And when you talk about social benefits yesterday, well, you didn't talk much about social benefits. You talked most about social costs. Right?
Yes,
But you have to take the other side of the ledger, the social benefits as well, correct?
yes.
Now,
Well, when you say, you keep saying you have to, and just to clarify, if you're doing a benefit cost analysis, you should be taking into account both the private and social costs and benefits. If you, in terms of a public sector project, let's call it, or a regulation or whatever, when you do that, you should be properly accounting for all of the costs and benefits, including the social ones.
but your point yesterday was that one of the shortcomings, at least I thought, this
Yeah,
was your
yeah.
point, one of the shortcomings of the Sticklitz and Hutchings approach is that they did not factor in social costs and social benefits into their economic rent analysis. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I called it a shortcoming, but it's true that they didn't do that. And I was citing Professor Grant, who was suggesting that any proper determination of economic rents should be broader and take into account the social costs and the social benefits.
Would you
Okay.
agree with me that Professor Grant was looking to forward looking into the future?
Well, he was looking at how you measure the value of resources for indigenous peoples. And he wasn't doing it in the context of an award for damages or anything. He was just trying to value the lands and the resources and so on. So whether it was forward looking or backward looking, I'm not sure, but I mean, I believe he would say these concepts and principles would be explicable whether you're looking backwards or looking ahead.
So they're relevant in order to determine what the economic rents were in the past. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think he would say that economic rents should always take those factors into consideration. And so if you're measuring economic rents that did or could have or should have accrued in the past, you should take that into account. And if you're looking ahead at an investment project or something, by the same token, you should take all of those factors into account as well.
I'm really more interested about your opinion than his. Do you agree with that opinion that you just espoused, that you proposed that was his opinion?
I would agree with that opinion,
Okay.
subject only to, and I always want to, to condition anything that I say. There may be circumstances where that wouldn't be necessary, and there may be somewhere it wouldn't even be appropriate. I don't know. But on the basis of my background, and this is what I did in government, I would agree with that. I would agree with Professor Grant that those things should be taken into consideration. And they often aren't.
Often,
Often are not.
thank you. Would you agree with me that the extraction of resources that historically took place in the Robinson Superior Treaty area required the consent and approval of government?
I believe so. This is a question of law, but from my understanding, I believe so. And I believe that's one reason they hastened into the treaties, because there was encroachment on the territories that wasn't sanctioned by the Anishinaabe or by the government. And so the entering into of the treaty gave the Crown the right to regulate the lands and territories and control that encroachment.
Would you agree with me, sir, that the government would not in the past have approved of a resource extraction if it believed that the social cost was greater than the social benefit?
I don't really have a good basis to have an opinion, yay or nay on that. I don't know the specific circumstances that well.
Well, perhaps I can ask it this way then.
Okay,
As an economist,
yeah.
would a government likely approve of projects where the social cost of the project is greater than the social benefit?
I have no doubt that's been done in the past. That is one of the reasons why, if you recall in my CV and my past experience, in the late 1970s and 80s at the federal level of government, there was a concern that some regulations that were being promulgated didn't adequately take into account both social costs and benefits. And so they questioned whether some of these regulations, the cost of them might actually exceed the benefits. And this was all in the context of a time in Canada, in the United States, of regulatory reform. There was a big push to look at, are we over-regulating, and should we have some mechanism to have a more accurate measurement of whether regulations are really beneficial or not? So,
Mr. Reardon, that's not the question I asked. I'm going to try and get back to it. I'm not asking the question about what the result was, because it might very well be that a government thinking to itself, the social benefit is greater than the social cost. Let's proceed with the project. And then they turn out to be wrong. That's possible.
that's possible.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is your understanding as an economist about how governments work.
Yeah.
They do not approve of projects that they believe when they're approving it, the cost is going to be greater than the benefit, do they?
They might. They might. They don't always know. They don't have perfect knowledge. And circumstances can change. And so I think
the question was on the basis of what they accept that they know.
if they already know that the costs will exceed the benefits,
Mhm.
it depends on what their definition of costs and benefits are.
Well,
I'm
let's
not
say-
trying to
let's say
be
it's a
difficult.
fixed- Let's
Yeah.
say it's a fixed definition of costs and benefits. Let's say
Yeah.
you go into the office one day and there's a bar chart and it says, these are the costs and these are the benefits, and the costs are higher than the benefits. Is that your question, Mr.
Well,
Schachter?
it's a conceptual one again. I mean, I'm not asking, maybe I can try it again. You worked in government. You're aware that government doesn't knowingly approve of projects where a social cost is greater than the social benefit. Would you agree with that?
I'm not trying to be difficult, but I know you want a simple answer, yes or no, but I'm reluctant to give that answer because I know of circumstances where, politically speaking, there may be a decision to do something because the benefits in some part of the country or to some constituency may be greater than the overall cost, but they may proceed with it anyway because government is complicated. The government is very complicated. I spent 33 years in government. I can attest to that. So I think your question is perfectly reasonable. And I wish I could give you a yes or a no, but I can't.
Maybe I can try it this way then. Would you agree with me that you can't tell me of one instance from 1850 to 2019 where the government of Ontario or the government of Canada extracted resources or allowed the extraction of resources where they believed when they approved of the project, the social benefit, where the social cost was greater than the social benefit? Is that a question you can answer?
Yes, but you may not like my answer. But I'll try. I'm being quite serious. I'm trying to be helpful to the court.
Okay.
The government doesn't always know the social costs and benefits, but even if they do, to Justice Hennessy's point, even if they do, they may decide to proceed with this project, knowing that the social costs or the private costs or whatever costs they know might exceed the benefits. One reason I already stated, and that is a local consideration. If a particular part of the country would benefit from that, they might proceed with it because their objective is broader than just the single project. They may wish to increase living standards in Newfoundland. They may wish to increase living standards of the Anishinaabe. I don't know, but there certainly could be circumstances where they would proceed. There's another consideration, and that is the time length. At one point, if it's a short-term time horizon, the cost could exceed the benefits. They may proceed in order to preserve the resource or extract the resource or whatever. Over the long term, the situation may change. They may not have knowledge of that, but they may have reason to think that over time, this could realize net social benefits and they would want to proceed. A third set of circumstances, if it's forestry resources, for example, there could be many years where they are spending more money than they're getting. They're losing money, but they're doing it in order to preserve the resource because they know it will have value further down the road. So there's no simple, easy yes or no answer to your question.
I'm gonna move on. Can you go to the compendium at volume 1 of 2, exhibit L.1, page 1.
Sorry, which tab?
Oh, sorry, it's tab 9.
Yeah.
It's tab 9. It's an article called Capturing Economic Rents from Resources Through Royalties and Taxes.
Yes.
And that's the wrong tab, sorry.
Oh, okay.
It's tab 10.
Yep.
I'm looking, I apologize.
No,
Tab 10, page 182. And when you go to tab 10, page 182, unfortunately, the printer printed the numbers on the bottom right-hand
oh,
side
yeah.
under black.
Yeah.
It's the potash article.
I've got it. Oh, I
It's
see it.
at the bottom left-hand side is page 5 of the potash article.
183?
It's 182, I believe, but if you look on the bottom left-hand side, there's a number 5.
Yes, I have
of
it.
the
Yes.
article.
Yes, yes.
And there's a heading, Saskatchewan's potash fiscal regime, our evaluation.
Yes.
Now, this is an article by Professor Mintz,
Yeah.
and in it, he writes, in principle, the government as owner of the resource should receive 100% of rents.
Mhm.
You see that?
Yes,
Do you agree with that?
in principle.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a perfect world, the government would collect all of the rents. Correct?
In a perfect world, I would say so too. Others might not, but I would.
Oh.
I mean, his point is they can maximize their revenue, without distortion. And we all agree on that.
All right. So could you turn to an part of Mr. Grant's paper? I left it up on the witness box for
Yes,
you.
I have it.
It's part of exhibit 1-005.
Yes.
And I've extracted the cover page and pages 11 through 14.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you a couple questions about it.
Okay.
At Article 2.4 on page 11, I'm going to read you what the author, Mr. Grant, says. He says, if economic rents define the potential income accruing to the landowner, comma, the actual income received depends upon the fiscal regime in place to capture rents. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
He then continues, since the rents generated by an investment project exceed the return necessary to attract capital into use, they may be taxed by a fiscal authority or the owner of the resource without causing the operating firm to significantly alter its level of current production. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
For this reason, economic rent is an important indicator of the potential fiscal benefits which could accrue to the owner of subsurface rights. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Over on the next page, page 12, the author, Mr. Grant, continues, the distribution of rents and the landowner's capacity to capture a fair return on the land therefore depends on appropriate royalty / taxation regime. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
He then continues, if the landowner fails to establish an adequate tax structure, a share of the rents will be captured by the private firm undertaking the investment project in the form of excess profits. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And at the bottom of the page 12, he writes, assuming a competitive bidding process, the landowner should capture all of the expected future rents. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that part of your criticism of Stiglitz and Hutching is they assumed a competitive bidding process in their analysis. Is that fair?
No, well, they actually assume perfect competition. So a competitive bidding practice isn't the same thing. In principle, it could result in something very similar, but in practice, it often doesn't.
All right, so
So
that's not a
there-
criticism that you had of their, the
No,
competitive bidding process issue was not something that you have a concern about with Stiglitz and Hutching. It's something else.
It's something else.
Gotcha. All right. Over on page 14. Would you agree that to the extent that rent collection is an ex post form of taxation of net revenue, the landowner has the capacity to capture all excess profits without undue impact on resource allocation and specifically rates of investment and production? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that. Subject to a little bit more, and that is what he's saying, I agree with. They can capture all of the rents ex post from taxation on net revenue, but they may not be able to retain it over time. And they may drive investment away. So depending on the tax rate they decide to impose to capture excess profits, he's talking about all excess profits. That may be all of the economic rent, or it may be a portion of the economic rent. I'm not certain. I agree with what he's saying in that sentence. That's the easy part. But everyone should bear in mind that it's not always possible to retain the taxes that you assess. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's a current one that's in the news this week, and that is a refund from the Canada Revenue Agency of $300 million to a uranium mining company called Cameco. They assessed tax on Cameco a number of years ago. Cameco appealed to the Tax Court of Canada. The CRA lost. They appealed that adverse decision to the Federal Court of Appeal and lost there. They sought leave to the Supreme Court of Canada and it was denied. And that was about $300 million of tax revenue that they are now returning to Cameco, which is a uranium company in Saskatchewan. So I'm not saying that those are resource royalties. They were income taxes. But the same thing could happen if you try to tax companies too much or reach too far. You can drive their investment away. I'm not suggesting that Cameco is moving anywhere, but it just illustrates, it nicely illustrates that assessing tax is one thing, retaining the tax is quite a different thing. And I say that as a former assistant commissioner of appeals, where we had to vacate or vary a large number of assessments where tax was initially assessed and collected, but then refunded.
I'm sorry, sir, you're not agreeing with Mr. Grant. Mr. Grant's,
I agree with his sentence.
no, you don't.
Yes, I do.
His proposition is that the landowner has the capacity to capture all excess profits without undue impact on resource allocation and specifically rates of investment and production. And you're saying, no, they don't because of what might happen. You disagree with Mr. Grant.
No, I agree with him. If he had added after the word capture, if he had added the two words and retain, I would have disagreed with him. But I agree with the sentence as written. And that's a lot of what we're talking about, the difference between the conceptual world and models and the real world.
Can we turn to paragraph 158 of your report, please?
How should we deal with this document? Just-
It's an.
It's already
exhibit or-
in,
Yeah, it's already an exhibit.
okay. We couldn't make it a tab to an extra.
Do you want to
tab
make
to
it
the appendix?
another exhibit? Would it, I'm fine. It is a bit redundant, but we could mark it an exhibit.
It's just helpful.
We have done this in the past. So why don't we mark it as the next exhibit in the cross-examination of Mr. O'Riordan? That would be fine.
Just an excerpt from the article by Hugh Grant
Yes.
on resource rents. You're okay.
I'll need
That's
a
fine.
copy.
And in fact, it might be helpful to identify that it's in that title, that it's excerpt from
Yes,
exhibit 1-005.
thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the page reference for the report either, or the paragraph reference. You were.
Yes,
you
just-
were
Oh, we're
coming to-
going to in a
We're
moment.
going to paragraph 158.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yes, I'm there.
I'm just waiting for the court to
Okay.
catch up.
One second. Thank you.
At paragraph 158 of your main report, you opine in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th line down,
Yes,
the line starting with or benevolence. I want to focus on these latter behavioral assumptions for the Anishinaabe and the Crown are not really consistent or compatible with the usual assumptions of rational behavior, self-interest, and utility maximization underlying most economic models, including the bargaining models laid out by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings next.
yes,
Now, the Anishinaabe behavioral assumptions that you are referencing, I take it, are respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and renewal as identified in the first part of paragraph 158.
that's correct.
And the Crown behavioral assumptions that you are referencing are justice, fairness, liberality, and benevolence.
Yes,
You recall that Stiglitz and Hutchings in their reply report posit that rational self-interest does not equate to ruthlessness or selfishness. Do you remember that?
yes,
Do you agree with Stiglitz and Hutchings on that?
well, I certainly agree with the ruthlessness aspect of it. The latter part is a little more difficult because self-interest, I mean, what does self-interest comprise? How broadly do you want to cast that term?
As broad as you understand it to be, sir. I'm looking for your
Well,
opinion.
well, if it's as broad as it is, as I believe it to be, it could be interpreted as selfish. Yeah, it's self-interest. You're maximizing your own self-interest
So it's
in terms of bargaining positions and bargaining theory.
okay. So self-interest, in your view, equates to selfishness.
Well, it could. I hate it when you put words in my mouth like that because
Well, that's what
I'm-
lawyers do. No, I don't intend to put words in your mouth. I'm trying to understand what your opinion is. And if we have a problem with understanding
Yeah.
definitions, it's best we articulate your understanding of words. so that
We all
get your
agree on
opinion.
that. Yeah. They're all based on self-interest. Rational behavior in our models is based on self-interest, and it means maximizing self-interest. Now, some individuals might consider that self-interest to be selfish. It depends on what they think selfish is. I'm trying to be helpful and agree wherever I can. It's just sometimes difficult because there's shades of gray all over the place in economics. Our main point in this paragraph, if I may, was talking about bargaining frameworks, and they were set aside by Stiglitz and Hutchings anyway. They preferred the shared risk model, the joint venture framework, and so on. So we didn't talk a lot about bargaining frameworks in our report, but I'm comfortable with this paragraph that you've cited. I do believe that there is an incompatibility between the Anishinaabeg principles that we've cited and the Crown's responsibility in a bargaining model. That's not what it's all about. Bargaining models work best with two private individuals trying to maximize their own utility.
At paragraph 159 of your report, you did opine that you assumed that both parties would act honorably and with mutual respect, despite what you say is a real difference in coercive and bargaining power. Do you see that there in paragraph 159?
Yes, I do.
Now, when you refer to acting honorably, are you assuming that the Crown would act in accordance with the guidelines or parameters set forth by the Court of Appeal, or what are you referring to by acting honorably?
By acting honorably at the time in terms of the negotiations over the treaty,
I'm okay. So that's what you were referring to.
well, I'm making reference to the Stiglitz and Hutchings report. So I mean, we are trying to respond to something that's stated in the Stiglitz and Hutchings report, and we're commenting around the practical utility of using the bargaining models. Okay, so they have made commentary around coercive power, and we're commenting that coercive power wouldn't necessarily have come into play, and certainly not if you assume that the two parties were acting honorably. It's nothing more than that.
Okay. Are you able to tell me what the coercive and power and bargaining, the difference in coercive and bargaining power that you're referring to in 159 is it? What is it?
Well, we're referring to their report, but they were talking about bargaining models in the context of the treaty, and they were acknowledging that there wasn't equal power between the parties. The Crown could have exerted leverage and coercive power simply because of the force of the Crown. The military force of the Crown is a good example, or sheer numbers, or however you want to measure it. That's all. I mean, we are both trying to look at alternative models of bargaining, and they decided to abandon them, and we're just making comments on frameworks that they ultimately decided to abandon. I mean, in our report, we could have not made any commentary, and I didn't really make much other than acknowledging that Dr. Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings had started from bargaining models and then moved to their shared risk joint venture model. That's all.
Sorry, I'm truly not trying to be sneaky or tricky or anything like that. I'm just trying to understand what you understood when you wrote those words at paragraph 159. You have helpfully told me that it is in relation to what happened in 1850
Yes,
or thereabouts.
yes.
And I have the same question about both parties would act with mutual and respect. Is the mutual respect you're referring to the Anishinaabeg principle of respect?
Both the principles of the Anishinaabe and the Crown. In the previous paragraph where we're citing those principles or obligations, we're simply saying, sorry, we're simply saying that they would honor those. And the paragraph is simply to say that setting aside those possible bargaining models, those bargaining models, the usefulness of them is not defeated by these assumptions because is not defeated by the difference in coercive power, which existed, if you assume that they acted honorably, both parties acted honorably. So we're saying they wouldn't necessarily have been taken out of consideration for that fact alone if you assume that the parties acted honorably. In reality, the Crown did not act honorably. And again, as I said yesterday, that's why we're all here. But the context here is just limited to an examination of bargaining models as a useful framework.
Okay.
And they rejected them because of the coercive power. And our commentary is, if both parties acted as the stated principles, you wouldn't necessarily have to eliminate the bargaining models. But ultimately, they were eliminated anyway. So I'm not sure all of this is all that relevant.
Thank you. At paragraph 155, can we go back, please, of your report? I wonder if this might be another typo. That you say, in our commentary on the sharing frameworks proposed by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, we implicitly substitute net Crown resources for wealth.
Yes.
Do you equate wealth with value?
I want to have a simple sort of statement of yes, but I have to think about value, because value is such a rich term in economics, value. Wealth is a measure of value.
Okay.
Uh,
When you
if-
say, oh, sorry, do you want
I'm
to add
sorry.
something?
I just wanted to say, if I may, on paragraph 155, again, the purpose there was simply to say that the context that they were examining these frameworks under was about sharing wealth. And our comment, we just wanted to preface our comments and say, we would, because we're looking, our lens is net Crown resources and not wealth, as we've stated earlier, we're just implicitly saying the same statements would apply to their comments about wealth in terms of net Crown resources. Nothing more than that. I think it's an innocent paragraph in that sense, but
Did you mean implicit or explicit?
implicit, because we're not stating it anywhere.
I see.
We're, yeah.
Okay. At paragraph 162 and 163, you opine on a 2022 federal government budget initiative about partnering with Indigenous peoples in natural resource projects. See that there?
Yes, we're citing the budget of
Would
last
you
year.
agree with me that whatever the views are in 2022, they are of no guidance for the court in trying to ascertain what the parties would have understood in 1850 when the treaty was concluded?
Yes.
At paragraph 164,
And again, I just hesitated because I think that's Justice Hennessy's decision to make, not mine. I don't know what value they would be to the court, but I do agree that times have changed in 2020 compared to 1850. So, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with that statement. Where Justice Hennessy may not, I'm not sure.
at paragraph 164, you observe that we know factually how natural resource development took place over the period 1850 to 2019.
Yes,
And I take by this, you mean we know how the Crown recorded on its books how the economic rents from the natural resources were actually extracted and recorded on the Crown's books?
no,
No, you don't mean that.
no, because they never recorded the economic rents. They recorded the tax revenues and expenses. And the statement's broader than that. I mean, we know the physical amounts of resources that were extracted because they were recorded. We have the books and records of the companies, and we have the government's books and records, the public accounts and so on, but we have no record of economic rents.
So would you agree with me that the actual amounts received by the Crown for the last 173 years is not a function of how they recorded the receipts of revenues in their books, but it's a question of what they actually received?
Okay, I'm sorry, but could you repeat the question again? Just
Would you agree with me that the correct and accurate amount that the Crown received from the natural resources for the last 173 years is not a function of how the Crown recorded the receipts of revenues in their books? It's an empirical fact as to what they did in fact receive.
no, I wouldn't agree with that.
No, you wouldn't.
No,
Why
what they
not?
received, they recorded. I think they've accurately recorded what they received.
I see. But some of it's recorded as taxes and some of it's recorded as NCRRs, correct?
No, I mean, the NCRRs are taxes. It's the type of tax that they record. They didn't have income taxes, until the First World War anyway, so they weren't recording those, but they recorded their royalties, they recorded their customs duties and their excise duties at the time. And I believe that they accurately recorded them. So all of the government revenues were accurately reported. When you talk about net Crown resource revenues, you're talking about gross revenues less expenses, and the expenses were recorded as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't talking about net Crown resource revenues.
Okay,
I was trying to talk about the benefits received from the natural resources.
but they didn't. There's no commonly understood definition of benefits of natural resource revenues. I can only speak to what was recorded by the companies and by the government.
Let's stick with the government. What they recorded is they recorded some NCRRs, correct?
Well, they didn't record them as such. We have to calculate those. And that's why there's not even agreement around all of the expenses in particular. So they never recorded those as such. We have records of their receipts and we have records of their expenses.
Could they have kept records if they wanted to?
Well, I mean, if you go through the public accounts, you can determine those amounts, and the other economists have done that, including Dr. Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. So it's just that for our purposes, the construct of net Crown resource revenues is important, but that wasn't a defined term at the time they were doing their journal ledger entries and assembling the public accounts. So they have to be constructed, and it's a tedious business, but yes, it can be done. The data is all there.
At paragraph 164, you opine that if there were shared resource management, this is in a but-for world that didn't actually happen,
Yes,
it would almost certainly have entailed more investor uncertainty and related risk than was actually experienced over the time frame.
yes.
Would you accept that the shared resource management does not mean that the Anishinaabe had a proprietary or ownership interest in the land, or do you say that that's what you're talking about proprietary ownership?
Well, Dr. Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings they have a conceptual notion of what that joint, venture ownership relationship might be. And as Justice Hennessy pointed out yesterday, it could be a legal agreement or it may not be. But in any event, if we're using it in a counterfactual scenario for purposes of calculating compensation, then we have to come up with that counterfactual scenario and impose it on that as opposed to the factual scenario that actually occurred. And our comments here is, if that relationship were there formally, and it would presumably be some sort of a legal understanding agreement, then access to capital markets would have been affected in a way different than what actually happened when the Crown borrowed money, when Canada was borrowing money in the United Kingdom. They wouldn't have had access to the capital markets at the same rate of interest as the Crown alone, because there would have been, we assume there would have been a risk premium, or they might not have been able to have borrowed the same amount of capital or whatever.
Mr. O'Riordan, in your counterfactual scenario, in your report, you cite Mr. Grant.
Yeah.
And he talks about the Anishinaabe having an ownership interest in the land, developing the land as if they owned it. That's
Yes.
the counterfactual world you use, correct?
No,
In making your comment that investment would have been different, you presume that the Anishinaabe have an ownership or a proprietary interest in the land.
that's right. But that's not our counterfactual scenario. That's Dr. Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' counterfactual scenario. We're commenting on what would have likely happened in their counterfactual scenario. As I presented in my slides yesterday, Dr. Mintz and I, when we don't have a counterfactual scenario because we weren't asked to create one. Had we created one, we've said quite explicitly, it would involve honor of the Crown augmenting annuities over time, generating net Crown resource revenues, and then sharing them with the Anishinaabe. That's our counterfactual scenario. We feel it would be more realistic. And to the extent that it wasn't satisfactory alone, we added that it could be adjusted with consideration to the wealth or income cap. I'm sorry for the law. Again, I'm just trying.
I'm going to put it to you, sir, that Mr. Stiglitz and Hutchings did not present a counterfactual world where the Anishinaabe owned the resources. Do you agree with that or not?
They didn't fill in a lot of blanks. They simply asserted that there was a joint venture relationship between the two. Whether it was legal or not, I do not know. But in order for them to capture all of the economic rents, that is one of the propositions that they made. And in order to distribute them along the lines they did, assuming a joint venture relationship, that's how they got the sharing of the resources. So they assumed something, and they just didn't make it explicit.
Could
Thank you.
I just go back to that? And I may have asked this yesterday on the same topic. Your criticism or your comment about less access to the capital markets and a risk premium is based on your presumption that the Stiglitz and Hutchings proposal assumes a proprietary interest held by the Anishinaabe in the land.
That's correct. And I believe that Hugh Grant's commentary around that makes the same presumption that was just cited by my friend.
That is a clear answer, and I think it would be a good idea to take a short break. I do expect I only have about a half hour left, so if we take a 15, 20-minute break, I could probably be done by 12:45.
Very good, thank you. Okay. No. Done with that. Okay, I'll take the break. Thank you.
All rise.
No, 15.
This court recess for 15 minutes. This court will now resume. You may be seated.
Hello, Mr. Reardon. Could you go to page paragraph 175 of your report?
Yes, I have it.
Now, at the very bottom of paragraph 175, you quote from an article from Angus Gilbert in at footnote 141, and what you quote is, for much of the 19th century, the Shield was seen not as a mineral-rich territory waiting to be exploited, but as a useless barrier blocking the northern and western expansion of agricultural settlement. And do you agree with that?
Well, I'm smiling. I'm smiling because we quoted it, but I'm watching Justice Hennessy smile too. And it strikes me as sort of an insulting sentence but it's the quote that's in the document. And
So you rely on
So-
it for your report.
we did cite it for our report. Yes. We didn't
Angus,
rely on it alone, but.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No,
No,
go
that's
ahead.
fine. I was about to say we didn't rely on it alone. We relied on other sources as well.
and as background, Angus Gilbert was the vice president of Laurentian University for many years.
Yes. And can we perhaps turn to that publication then? A vast and magnificent land edited by Matt Bray and Ernie Epp, exhibit 1-2104. And did I put, did we hand up an excerpt of it? And so we handed up an excerpt of page 93, which is where you got the quote.
Yes.
Now, the writer continues and says, the failure to grasp, this is the middle of the page,
I have it. Yes.
the paragraph, the failure to grasp the significance of the wealth that lay within the shield is hardly surprising. Mining in the north could only be difficult. Obviously, markets, capital, and labor were necessary, but even more important were technology and cheap transportation to permit exploration, to bring men and supplies in, and to ship ore out. And then the author says this: the pattern was there from the beginning, and it was inescapable, : mines would be developed by and for outsiders. Circumstances also dictated another pattern, at least in the beginning. Mining development would depend on the building of railways. But since railways were built for other purposes, mineral discoveries would be made haphazardly and by chance. See that there?
Yes, I do.
And do you have any reason to doubt the accuracy of that statement?
Not at all.
Thank you. Now, you also had as one of an option, can I call it an option for the judge or something for the judge to look at? You had various possibilities, and one of them was a 10% population base
yes.
share.
Yes.
Do you know what the population of the Anishinaabe was in 1850?
I probably did it one time. I can't cite it off the top of my head here. I'm sorry.
Might it have been close to 100%?
Yes, it probably was. I'm sorry. I thought you meant the absolute population as opposed to the proportion of the population.
No,
Perhaps
I meant as a proportion of the population. Because
As a proportion of, fine. Yeah, no, I would assume, yeah, I would say it was probably close to 100%.
so if they're sitting in 1850, is it also, I mean, you have this 10% amount, and
Yes, yes. I see where you're going.
where am I going?
Oh, I'm sorry if I shouldn't perhaps say that. The 10% today is probably a much lower proportion of the population than it was historically across the 19th century. Is that where you're going?
Is another, if we're looking at percentages, if the judge wants to go there, if it's at all relevant,
Yes.
would it also be perhaps reasonable for the judge to look at the population in 1850% proportion?
Yes, the population across the time horizon would be relevant.
Now, you didn't do that analysis at all.
No, we didn't. I mean, we didn't go into those options in depth. We simply, the term I think I used yesterday was a menu of possible approaches or options. And I apologize if I predicted your question. I didn't mean not to be polite, but I immediately took your point that if that was the approach, it would also be important and relevant to look at population as it changed, the proportions changed over the relevant time horizon.
Or it might be important just to look at the population at the time of the bargain, right?
I don't think so, because really the damages didn't really start until the annuities weren't augmented. So for that purpose, I would assume that would be, say, from 1875 to the current day or something like that. But again, that's not my responsibility. I don't believe it should be fixed in time anymore at the beginning of the time stream than at the end of the time stream. So as much as you could criticize our suggestion, our example of 10%, I would also criticize the 100% at the beginning of the time stream.
I want to turn, if I could, sir, to I'm going to call it the Stiglitz and Hutchings 8416 sharing arrangement. And that's my words, not, I don't want to get into the
Right.
hard phraseology of joint management or I'm just going to call it an 8416 sharing arrangement.
Okay.
And we both know what we're talking about, right?
Yes, yes.
Now, I want to present some hypotheticals to you as an economist and see if you can answer these for me. I want you to assume in this hypothetical that the Anishinaabe in 1849 had the right to all the economic rents from the land. That's an assumption.
Okay.
I want you to assume that in 1849, again, this is prior to the treaty being entered into, there was only one purchaser for the RST territory, and that one purchaser was the Crown.
Okay.
And I then want you to assume that the one purchaser Crown was only prepared to pay a fixed annuity up to a maximum of $12,400 per year. And that if they paid that $12,400 per year, there would not be any augmentation at all.
Understood.
So again, these are just assumptions.
Yes.
Now, am I correct in understanding that economics would tell us that if there was a sale of the land at that time, the sale price could be expressed as a capital sum that would earn $12,400 per year?
Well, it could be. I suppose it depends on how the capital was invested. But
But the
But it could
capital would
be.
have to be invested to spit off or earn $12,400 per year to pay the annual annuity.
yes, yes.
Okay. And
Can I just make sure when you say that if there was a sale of land at the time, the sale price could be expressed as the sale, this transaction of this agreement could be expressed as?
the sale price for the treaty territory could be expressed as a capital sum
Okay,
that would earn $12,400 per year.
Yes.
You would agree?
Okay. Yes. Yes.
Okay, and I just would ask you now to, let's assume in our hypothetical that the Crown is short on cash and is only prepared to pay $2,000 per year, but this time, together with a promise to share in the economic rents the Crown might get in the future.
Yes.
But again, it's just a
Yes.
hypothetical.
Mhm.
Under this hypothetical that I've proposed to you, would you agree that the Crown is prepared to pay 16% of what the Crown itself set as what I'm calling the normal price for the land? Right? The normal price being the 12,400. I want you to assume
Mhm.
that we're calling that the normal price. Would
And
you
it-
agree with me that,
Expressed as an annuity that would be given to the landowner?
yes, to the
Yes,
Anishinaabe?
as proceeds from the capital invested.
That's right, because
Yeah.
they're only prepared to pay 2,000, but they themselves have set the
They-
normal price at
Yes,
12,400.
Yes, they don't have cash flow in order to actually make that full payment.
Right. You would agree with me, I mean, mathematically, I
Yeah.
hope you're not going to disagree with me that it's 16%. 2,000
Yes.
divided by 12,400 is 16%.
Yes.
So would you agree with me that in my hypothetical, that Stiglitz and Hutchings 84-16% sharing result of the Crown revenues from the treaty territories is a reasonable result that is consistent with economic principles? And before you answer, I'm not saying the only reasonable result, but it's a reasonable result consistent with economic principles. Would you agree?
I agree with your hypothetical example. In the case of Hutchings and Stiglitz, the question is where the $10 comes from in order to for that 16% to be derived. So we know that there was $1.60 per capita that was given as the annuity.
But that was an assumption.
That was an
put to-
assumption.
Put to you
Yeah.
in the question.
Well,
So he's just asking you to work with the assumptions.
okay.
So working with the assumption, is the 84-16 sharing arrangement a reasonable result that is consistent with economic principles?
See, the difficulty I have in just simply agreeing with that is what they're sharing. So if it was just the annuity, as you've just described, I have no problem with that. But they're using that split to apportion economic rent, which is a different denominator than the capital that the Crown would have paid as a full value purchase. They're talking about that in the context of economic rent.
Yeah.
So we can't forget that. And if we do forget that, then I'm okay.
So if we take my hypothetical.
Yeah, you're hypothetical.
Then it is a reasonable result that is consistent with economic principles.
With financial principles, even, I would say.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you. But economic principles too.
I'll say yes.
Okay. Can we move then to my last question, a series of questions? One of the complaints you have about the Stiglitz and Hutchings model is about risk. Remember that?
Yes,
And one of the things you said yesterday was that the Anishinaabe don't have a downside.
yes.
Now,
They have a downside, as I described it, a political downside to the extent that the Crown doesn't honor the commitment that it signed on the treaty.
but let's examine that for a moment about whether they have a financial downside, if you don't mind. I want to discuss that a bit. Now, you made the point is they have an annuity of $2,000 per year that can't go down, you say.
Yes,
That's what you said yesterday.
yes, there's a floor, yeah.
Right. Now, would you agree with me that in calculating whether there's excess, or whether there's shareable NCRRs, we'll use the NCRs for example.
Yeah.
Whether there's shareable NCRRs, the first thing that the Crown does is it takes the gross resource revenues and deducts off expenses.
Yes,
Do you agree that one of the expenses is the $2,000 per year?
yes,
So to say that the 2,000 is a guaranteed floor is actually inconsistent, I would put to you, with the way any of the experts in this court case have dealt with the 2,000, because it does go negative. Wouldn't you agree?
no, sorry, I mean, it's a financial cost to the Crown, the 2,000, but it's not a net Crown resource revenue. In other words, it's not a Crown expense related to the revenues, related to the resources. The Crown has a legal obligation to pay the annuities. We're talking about two different things. When we're talking about net Crown resource revenues, we go back to those ledgers that I talked about in the public accounts where we've got resource revenues from the sale of the land and the resources, and we've got expenses directly related to those expenses.
Yeah, I wonder if you could just pick up an excerpt of Exhibit 8, which is part of the expert report of David Hutchings, in which he has a table 17 with nominal net crown revenues.
Yes,
And I'm not going to ask you to agree that these numbers are correct. That's not the point of my questions.
Mhm.
My point is to show you how he treated the negative amounts. And so I want to go to 1856. And at least Mr. Hutchings has a positive amount in 1856 of $17,971. You see
Yes.
that there?
yes, I do.
Now, if that money had all been dispersed, right? Included in that $17,000 would be taking into account the $2,000 that what you call the floor. Do you agree with that? Or do you think that the $2,000 is not part of the 17,000?
It's not part of the $17,000.
Okay,
It's this $17,971 is an amount, part of which they could use to augment that annuity that
okay,
year.
all right. Now let's go to 1857. We have a negative $359 amount,
Yes,
but we know that the Crown still pays $2,000, right?
that's right. And that's an illustration of what I meant when I said there's a floor and the Anishinaabe are insulated from suffering that market
To-
risk.
Okay, but the Anishinaabe have to make up the $359, right?
What do you mean when you say they have to make it up?
Well, the way that Mr. Hutchings has calculated it, at the end of the day, the Crown gets the benefit of that negative $359, correct?
Well, it absorbs the loss.
The Crown absorbs the loss?
Well, it is a loss.
It is a loss on operations, but the Anishinaabe, in Mr. Hutchings' calculations of NCRRs,
Yes,
he gives the Crown credit for that $359. You understand that?
when you say it, he gives the Crown credit, I'm just hesitant to know what you're.
What I
getting at
mean
by
is that he comes up with a present day value.
Yes, he deducts it.
Right.
Yeah, he did.
deducts
Oh,
it.
okay, so that's fine. Yeah, I get
Right,
that.
and so when he deducts it, he not only deducts the $359, he deducts the
The present value.
present day value,
Yes.
including compound interest
Yes,
on each negative number.
yes. To treat the sums consistently, the positive and negatives, they are compounded. And that amount obviously mushrooms over time to present value. Yes,
And in his calculation overall, before the Anishinaabe are entitled to anything, what gets deducted off is the $2,000 they've already received. You understand that as well?
no,
No?
that doesn't get deducted.
Okay, so you didn't think. he
We're only
deducted
talking
that.
about augmenting, the augmentation of the annuity. The annuity itself is guaranteed. No question.
So maybe I can put it to you this way. So your understanding is if there is a $1,500 net Crown revenue amount in a year, the Anishinaabe would get the $2,000.
Mhm.
Plus the parties would have sat down to discuss how much more
Yeah,
of the $1,500 they would get.
yes,
So that's your analysis is built on that assumption.
yes.
All right, thank you.
And they would do this periodically. The treaty doesn't specify the frequency of the augmentation. it says the Crown will do so from time to time. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing the treaty, but uh, one approach could be each year to sit down and see what those net Crown resource revenues translate into and make an augmentation to the annuity.
Thank you, sir. Can you move to paragraph 222? And I've only got a couple questions left and then I'm done.
Our documents in my report, Paragraph?
Sorry, paragraph 222 of your main report.
yes, okay.
At paragraph 222, you give an opinion about practical challenges, suggest it may be an issue better addressed by governments in the general and broader context of policies.
Yes,
You see that there?
I do.
This is not an economic principle you're opining on right now. It seems to be a personal opinion, if I can call it that. Is it?
I would characterize it as a public policy opinion rather than a personal opinion. I mean, Dr. Mintz and I, in our discussions, we discussed this and we just felt, given the current environment and circumstances and so on, in addition to the responsibility of Justice Hennessy to arrive at a suitable quantum for compensation, there are parallel discussions that are going on that are meant to address the income gap. And so those discussions could be taken into consideration to the extent that other public policies are addressing the same issue. It may be better addressed in that context with no, I mean, I'm not, when I say better addressed, I don't mean that Justice Hennessy wouldn't address it equally well or better. It's just that you've got two simultaneous policies at the same time. I deal with this all the time. I did in government, I do now, where we've got policies in parallel, and sometimes they can even be at cross purposes. One example I just commented on in the budget was the goal to increase immigration by up to 500,000 people a year, simultaneously trying to resolve the housing situation in Canada, where we've got a significant housing shortage. And I was saying there's a risk that these two public policies could work at cross purposes. Not to disagree with the goals in either case. It's just that that's where I mean, government is complicated and government's objectives are complicated. And that's the only reason we set this down in writing, is just that it could be that problem might be better addressed in the context of the federal government's efforts in reconciliation.
My only point was that a public policy opinion is not an economic opinion from an economist.
But Dr. Mintz and I are both qualified in public policy.
So on public policy then, our Anishinaabe government, Anishinaabe First Nations governments.
Yes.
So when you say in paragraph 222 that perhaps the judge should leave it to the governments, that could include the governments of the First Nations to decide.
Yes, certainly it could. I mean, our interpretation was that because the Crown had not honored its treaty obligations, I mean, that's what the Ontario Court of Appeal was getting at, to take these factors into account in that context as well. But yes, I like that actually, because we all have responsibilities and accountabilities, and to the extent that they can address those, the Anishinaabe governments can address those issues. That's wonderful. I mean, that's the whole point of self-government.
Thank you. Can you turn to paragraph 218, please?
Yes. Paragraph 218?
Paragraph 218.
Yes, yeah.
At paragraph 218, and you can tell me if I'm not summarizing it fairly, but in paragraph 218, You say that if the Anishinaabe were given large amounts of money individually, they would not realize gains in labor productivity, achieve their full economic potential, or contribute to the overall social and economic welfare and living standard of the country as a whole. See that?
Yes.
I'm going to paraphrase further. And first of all, that's a fair paraphrase that I just gave. Yes.
Yes.
What you're suggesting, sir, is that if you give Anishinaabe money, they'll just sit on their couches collecting money.
No, I'm certainly not suggesting that. That's not the intention of the paragraph. It was simply to set out, this is labor economics and incentives to work, and the impact that taxes could have on incentives to work, or in, transfer payments that would substitute market activities and so on. These are comments that apply to individuals, not necessarily just to the Anishinaabe.
Sir, you can't make generalizations about that, about what people would do if they got large sums of money, can you?
I would say we can. I mean, we have empirical studies, and that's what labor market economics is all about. Looking at labor market conditions, looking at conditions of demand and supply and so on. I mean, honestly, we would never intend that as a pejorative comment against the Anishinaabe. Dr. Mintz and I would never want that paragraph to be interpreted in that way.
Well, Professor Mintz, in conversation with him when he was on the stand, we took him to the fact that the chairman of Imperial Oil makes over $17 million US in 1 year. He's not sitting on his couch. He's still working. So why couldn't the Anishinaabe be like him? Why do you assume the Anishinaabe would not be like him? It's an uncomfortable question.
I'm not assuming that they would not work. I'm just saying, to the extent that they have more income, there's less incentive to do other things. And I'm not blaming them if they don't do these other things at all. And I'm not saying they're sitting on their whatever. What I'm saying is everything in economics is relative. So it means that the returns on labor in relative terms are less. The return on leisure is higher. And when we use the term leisure, we mean it broadly, as in all kinds of non-market activities. An Anishinaabe might wish to do more hunting and fishing, for example, because he gets utility from being in the natural environment and enjoying that. He wouldn't have to work to get that income. He might decide to substitute.
Wouldn't have to work in the paid labor market.
In the paid market, yeah. And that raises another possibility that there could be more decisions to stay at home. In other words, the Anishinaabe female labor participation rate might fall because more of them would be free to do work at home that they get more enjoyment from.
Or the parent participation.
Raising children, doing all kinds of things. We mean nothing more than that. We need nothing more than that.
Well, we learned from looking at the Imperial Oil or discussing with Jack Mintz that Imperial Oil has approximately 43 billion in assets. And, you would agree that if the Anishinaabe had 43 billion in assets, then perhaps their members would be sitting on boards and would be directing the affairs of new companies.
Absolutely.
Perhaps, yes.
Their own companies.
Companies we might call Anishinaabe Oil or Anishinaabe Tree and Gravel. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But they could be the captains of industry.
They could be. Some of them could be, but not all of them would be. And certainly, we're just saying for some people, this would provide them freedom to enjoy the good life. That's all. Instead of working underground at Falconbridge, like I did as a student, they wouldn't have to do that unless they wanted to. And they may still do that. I don't, you're correct. I do not know that. I'm just talking from economic principles. This is the sort of implication. That's all, nothing more.
Um, Just going back for one moment, we had reference to Exhibit 8. And part of Mr. Stiglitz's report, Mr. Hutchings' report, excuse me.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, those were only illustrative because he does correct the numbers later on in his report.
Oh, yes, I remember.
Right, so I just
It's
wanted to
just to
use,
illustrate points.
I just wanted to try and understand
Understood.
things. Anything else? I have no more questions, Mr. O'Riordan. The court might have some questions. And I believe Mr. Spencer Bass has some questions. Thank you very much for
Thank
your
you.
time.
Thank you.
And just before I get started, Your Honor, I know you mentioned that you have a hard stop
At 1
for a
o'clock.
1 o'clock
I mean,
call.
1 minute before 1 o'clock.
Okay, certainly. I may well be finished before that time, but I will try and be conscious of the time to ensure that we break by then if I'm not.
And if not, it's a short break that I need.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. O'Riordan.
Good afternoon.
My name is Spencer Bass. I'm counsel for 7 of the Lake Superior First Nations in this matter. And I just have a few questions for you this afternoon. Yesterday in your testimony, you testified that the economic rent approach is, and I believe I'm using your words, not an easy path to follow. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And then you said, by contrast, the net crown resource revenue path is a simpler one to follow, correct?
yes, correct.
And you admitted yesterday as well, you're not a historian, correct?
Correct.
And you weren't qualified to provide the court with an opinion on what the intention of the parties was back in 1850, correct?
Correct.
And so you can't speak to whether the intention of the Anishinaabe in 1850 was that the augmentation clause should be based on the economically simplest path to follow, correct?
Correct.
You also testified yesterday that the net crown resource revenue approach is the best method to determine the counterfactual where the crown had in fact honored its treaty obligations. Do you recall that?
I do.
And that would be true if the crown's obligations under the treaty was only to augment the annuities over the past 170 years based on the net crown resource revenues that they actually received, correct?
Correct.
I'm just going to ask you to take your pace down a bit.
Certainly, my apologies. And so if the treaty obligation is broader and in augmenting the annuity from time to time, the crown was required to consider the value of the resources being extracted or the economic rents, just assume that with me for now, then wouldn't the counterfactual for the world where the crown had in fact honored its treaty obligations be different,
Yes,
right? If the crown's obligations under the treaty is different, the counterfactual for that world would of course be different.
yes.
I want to ask you a few questions about the risks borne by the parties, and Mr. Schachter asked you a few questions in this area. I just have a couple more. And you testified both yesterday and in some of the questions from Mr. Schachter that the real risk that was borne by the Anishinaabe in the augmentation clause was the political risk that the crown wouldn't honor its obligations, right?
Right.
And you testified that the Anishinaabe didn't take on any of the market risk.
Correct.
And in your opinion, the market risk was entirely borne by the Crown.
Yes.
And I believe Mr. Schachter asked you some questions in this area as well, but you're aware that when the treaty was first signed in 1850, the annuity at that point amounted to the equivalent of $1.60 per person.
That's right.
And then, of course, there was the augmentation clause, which brings us all to court today. And that was the promise that the Crown would increase the annuity if the ceded territory produced an amount that would allow them to do so without incurring loss, correct?
Correct.
And at the time, back in 1850, neither the Crown nor the Anishinaabe knew precisely how many resources were contained in the treaty territory. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
They also didn't know at the time how much the land in the treaty territory could be sold for, if it could be sold at all.
Yes.
And so there was the possibility in their minds that maybe not that much resource wealth would be produced from the treaty territory.
That was possible. Yes.
The possibility was that maybe not that many minerals would be discovered.
Yes.
Maybe the land couldn't actually be sold.
Yes.
And so there was the possibility that the territory would never produce enough to enable the Crown to augment the annuity without incurring a loss, correct?
That's correct.
And so if that happened, the annuity would remain at a total of $2,000, or what was at the time the equivalent of $1.60 per person. You're nodding, is that?
I am not, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm agreeing.
Sorry, we
I
need to get the, we
apologize.
need to get the
Thank
verbal
you for the
answer
reminder.
for the reporter, but
Yes.
thank you for that. And so would you agree that that was a risk to the Anishinaabe in 1850?
Oh, yes. Look, I probably should have explained when I used the term political risk, they had a financial risk. It just wasn't a market risk. I mean, they clearly were at risk of not getting, of not having an augmentation to the annuity. But their main risk was that political risk, because they were depending on the Crown to make that determination, right? So they were subject to some financial risk. If what I paraphrase as if the Crown had not honored its commitment properly, they certainly were at risk. But I agree with everything that you've said. I mean, it's a possibility that those annuities would never have been augmented if the Crown could not do so without loss. In fact, in the counterfactual you set out, where substituting, the value of the resources or the economic rents or whatever, in that counterfactual, if the phrase without loss was still there, they would never be able to do that. They couldn't do that without loss.
So I want to thank you for that answer. I want to break it down a little bit more, because I think there were two different risks that were being discussed there. So
Yeah.
you mentioned the political risk, and that would be the political risk that the Crown would not honor its obligations.
Yes,
So that would be the risk that the treaty territory would produce enough for the Crown to augment the annuity, but for whatever reason, the Crown chooses not to do so.
exactly.
But I'm talking about a different risk here, and I think you mentioned that as well, to be fair.
Yeah.
Which is that the treaty territory simply would not produce enough to allow the Crown to augment the annuity without incurring a loss.
Yes,
And so that would be even the Crown fully complying with its obligations, there is this risk, you described it as a financial risk,
Mhm.
that the Crown would not have to augment the annuity.
yes.
And so that the annuity would remain
Remain the same.
the same, $1.60 per person.
Yes. I mean, and the Crown didn't consider augmenting it to take into consideration inflation if and when it occurred. But yes, if I read that, I agree with you.
Okay, and that's a financial risk
Yes,
that the Anishinaabe bore in
Yeah.
1850.
Yeah.
So I want to discuss a little bit the area of social costs. And again, you discussed this area a little bit with Mr. Schachter earlier as well. And I believe yesterday you testified, and I believe you said the same thing earlier today as well, that the economic rent approach should account for social costs.
Yes, and again, my only hesitation, it could, and perhaps it should in some circumstances, account for social cost.
Okay, that's fine. It could, and perhaps it should.
Yes,
Okay. And the example that you spoke about yesterday was remediation costs for environmental damage caused by resource extraction. Is that correct?
that's correct.
And if you recall, you had some discussion on this point with Justice Hennessy. She asked you some questions about it. And she had raised the possibility that the government could pass laws for private actors to account for the remediation. And you accepted this as a possibility. Do you
I-
recall that?
I did, yes.
And indeed, are you aware that the Ontario government already does do this to some extent?
Yes,
And the example that I'm thinking of, and you may have others, is that under the Mining Act and its regulations, there are requirements for mining companies to rehabilitate and remediate mining lands.
yes,
And so to the extent that these legislative requirements exist, they would be built into the costs of the companies, right?
that's correct.
And as built-in costs, they would impact the profits that the company is able to obtain.
That's correct.
And this impact on profits would be reflected in the returns that investors would be able to obtain from the companies in the industry.
Yes, to the extent that they're public companies, the shareholders would have adjusted returns that would take those costs into account, probably.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you a few questions about the population sharing model that you proposed in your report. And as I understand the model being proposed is that the share owing to the Anishinaabe would be equivalent to their relative share of the population of the territory compared to the non-Indigenous population. Do I
That's-
have that correct?
That's correct. I think we described it as the beneficiaries of the treaty. If we didn't, I apologize, but that's what we're getting at exactly.
Okay. That's fair. And perhaps I'm using the term
Yeah,
Anishinaabe equivalently with the beneficiaries of the treaty, but I think we're on
Thank
the
you.
same page.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And to assist the court, you had estimated the share of the population of the Indigenous population of the Robinson Superior Territory. And you estimated it to be around 9.6%, around 10%, correct?
that's correct. That's the best data that Dr. Mintz could find. So we went with that just as an illustrative example of what we're getting at. Yes.
Okay, and that was actually my next question. They were illustrative numbers only.
Only, yeah,
And you actually say in your report that more precise numbers would be needed to calculate the actual amounts of.
exactly.
And you haven't sought to obtain those more precise numbers.
No, we have not. We were not charged with doing actual calculations in any of these cases. We were just using illustrative examples.
And to be clear, the estimate that you provided was only of the Indigenous population in the territory as of 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that goes to the earlier point raised this morning that to do a proper calculation, you would have to have considerably more data over the time horizon relevant here.
Right. And so Mr. Schachter asked you a number of questions on that area. I'm not going to repeat those questions. But the question that I did have there is, so if you're doing the year by year analysis, as you mentioned, the more non-Indigenous people who moved into the territory over the years, the less the amount that would be due to the treaty beneficiaries over time, correct?
Yes, their share would fall.
Right.
Yeah.
The more non-Indigenous people that move in, the share of the population of the Indigenous population goes down.
That's better because we've two variables at work here. We've got the overall net Crown resource revenues, which could be increasing depending on economic activity. And then what we're talking about is how you allocate those. So the share could go down, but the absolute payments might actually go up if the rate of growth is sufficient to sustain that.
Right. Okay, so putting aside what the NCR is, the
Yeah.
net Crown resource revenues, or the amounts that need to be shared, whatever those are over time, the relative share of that number that would be owable to the treaty beneficiaries would go down as the non-Indigenous population goes up.
Yeah, and I've been nodding and now I'm saying yes.
I appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
So the last question was the share going to the treaty beneficiaries.
The
would-
relative share going to the treaty beneficiaries would decrease as the non-Indigenous population of the territory increases.
Yes,
I have that correct?
you have that correct. Yeah.
And you would also agree with me, Mr. O'Riordan, that the Crown can enact policies that would encourage more non-Indigenous people to move into the territory?
I don't think they would enact policies expressed that way. They could enact policies that could result in that because they would probably not say, we want more non-Indigenous people. They would say, we want more people for some reason. And so the people would decide whether they would actually move or not. And that would include the Anishinaabe. To the extent that all of the treaty beneficiaries are already in the territory, obviously that number can't increase. I'm just referring to other Indigenous peoples who might come to the territory, and whether they might become treaty beneficiaries or not is beyond my competence. So I know that's a long answer. I'm agreeing with you just with that caveat that I don't believe the government would ever express it that way. We want more non-Indigenous people here.
Right. I would certainly hope that a government, at least in 2023, would not say that the intention of their policy is to move more non-Indigenous people
Right.
into the territory. But you at least agree that the government can enact policies that have the effect
That would
of
have the effect of,
increasing
yes, yes, for sure.
We're talking about something that's on everyone's radar,
Radar.
the direction of immigration
Immigration.
settlement.
Yes.
Is that does that fit your question, sir?
I believe it does. And so to follow up with that, actually moving backwards in time, and in fact, in your report, you identify at least one such Crown policy, which was the grant of free lands in the territory, correct?
Yes.
And actually, perhaps why don't we go there directly? So let's go to paragraph 66 of your report.
I have it. Yep.
And then looking kind of a bit more than halfway down the paragraph, the sentence starts with, on the other hand, and you write, initial land grants encourage migration to the territories. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And would you agree with me that the migration that was encouraged at the time was predominantly non-Indigenous migration?
Yes.
And again, the impact of such policies, if we were to use the population share model, would be to decrease the relative share of the net Crown resource revenues that would be due to the Anishinaabe, correct?
Yes, but apologies if I may repeat myself, but in the context of what we're talking about, you know, we say it enabled the importation of cheaper products and so on and so on. We needed the labor, we needed the materials in order to generate the resources. So if that immigration had not been encouraged, we couldn't extract any of the revenue from the resources. So again, several things are happening simultaneously. There are more non-Indigenous persons who are arriving on treaty territory, but that is helping us develop the resources so that we're generating the revenues that can be shared. So so we can have an augmentation factor that's operative and is in the black, right?
So to break that down a little bit more, so on your and Professor Mintz's theory, the migration into the territory would increase the absolute net crown resource revenues,
Yes,
but at the same time would decrease the share that is due to the treaty beneficiaries if we were to use the population share approach.
yes.
And you didn't do the calculations to say necessarily whether the one outstripped the other.
No.
And sticking with the population share approach a little bit, you testified yesterday that the population sharing model could be easily viewed as insufficient or inadequate in terms of appropriate compensation. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Well, especially with the illustrative example that we used, where currently it's only 10%. I don't know whether it would be deficient if we were to do that calculation over the entire time horizon, where the population was 100% or close to it at the beginning, and then gradually, in some years quickly, declined from there. But our comments still hold that absolutely, whatever that result is, which we haven't quantified yet, could be adjusted using the concept of the wealth gap.
Okay. And actually, in your slides, in your trial demonstratives, I think you actually go a little bit further. So can we actually take a look at slide 31? And I'm looking at your third bullet point on slide 31. Just let me know when you get there.
Yep. Yes, okay.
Okay, and on the third bullet point,
Just let me get.
oh, my apologies.
Go ahead.
And so at the third bullet point of slide 31, you wrote, if this approach to revenue sharing, referring to the population share approach, is not adequate in view of current and historical differences in income or wealth between the two groups, and then you put in parentheses, as it almost certainly would not be, it could be used as a first step in a two-step process. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And so in your slides, you take the position that the population share approach on its own would almost certainly not be adequate.
Yes, but again, to put it in context, we were simply using that illustrative example. And so that's why we said, as it almost certainly would not be, because if you use the current gap and the current population share, clearly it wouldn't be sufficient to bridge that gap if that were your goal. And furthermore, we're not suggesting bridging the entire gap is what's needed here, but to take it into consideration as a factor in the overall compensation.
Right. And so at least on the illustrative example that you provided, it would almost certainly not be adequate.
Yes.
And then so as the second step in the process, you would then have to top up the compensation award based on what you refer to as an escalation factor.
Yes.
And you have not calculated or estimated what this escalation factor would be in this case?
No, we have not.
And you have not proposed a particular escalation factor?
No, we would need to know the initial steps quantum first, and even then I would be hesitant to opine on an augmentation factor, because I believe that's the role of Justice Hennessy.
Right. On the escalation factor.
I'm sorry, what did I say?
I believe you said augmentation factor.
Sorry. Yes, escalation. Thank you for the correction.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Riordan. I believe those are my questions.
Thank you.
Justice Hennessy, did you have any additional questions?
No, thank you very much.
I don't have any questions. On the direct.
Thank you. Mr. Rankin, has anyone invited you? If you have any questions?
No question.
Very much. Mr. O'Riordan, You're finished. You- you,
am indeed.
have completed, you have completed your examinations on behalf of the court. I also give you my thanks for the work you have done for this case, for being here, and the contribution you have made. It is all an important contribution, and we very much respect, or we very much appreciate the respect that you have shown this process and the court. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. It's an honor to meet you, actually.
All right then. So your release, sir. Hope
Thank
you get
thank you.
whatever plane you're hoping to get. We're breaking now until Monday at 10. Is there anything we need to know then?
I don't believe so. We'll be ready to go with the next witness, Professor Eric Kersner.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to take 2 minutes here.
Oyez, oyez, oyez. The sittings of this court have now concluded. Long live the king.